All right, welcome to another Stopping Socialism video. I'm Donald Kendal, joined, as always, by Justin Haskins. So, lately we've been doing a couple of videos, and we're going to continue to do it. Videos that kind of cover just like these items or these topics that exist in the socialism sphere. I mean, a lot of these videos that we do are just based on, like, what was the latest thing Joe Biden said, or some silly thing about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But we want to do some videos that are kind of based on these ideas that are found throughout socialism, so they're a little more evergreen and some interesting facts that you should know if you're following our channel here. So one of the things that we constantly come across when we're reading about socialism is the desire of all these different socialist regimes to create like the new Soviet man, or like the, as we put it here, the model socialist citizen. So I think the most popular version of this was kind of in the USSR, where that's where that term, the socialist new man, came from. So basically, they were trying to figure out ways to condition people to basically operate in the way that helps the regime and the socialist movement, and to kind of tear away all of the things that kind of made somebody that exists as an individual and group them into the model socialist citizen. So I guess the first question, Justin, because we have a bunch of examples here, but I guess the first question is like, why? Why do they need to do this? Why do they need to have like the citizen be so kind of transformed into this like little, model citizen?
So I think that, are you asking from the perspective of should I be answering as a Soviet comrade, or should I be answering as a person who thinks this is all garbage?
Dealer's choice.
Dealer's choice. Okay. So I think the Soviet at the time, let's start with this. I think that the real reason that they did this is because whether they were willing to admit it or not, and I think some of them eventually did, were willing to admit it. Socialism, when you really try to make these big grand socialist systems, they ultimately don't work. And the reason for that at its core is eventually you socialize enough things that there's no incentive for individual people to work harder or to pursue their own interests, because ultimately those things get stifled. Either because taxes are too high in sort of a progressive situation, like in America, for example, you could get to a situation where taxes are so high that there's really no reason to continue working. There was a period of time in American history where the top marginal tax rate was like 90%, right? And so a lot of people just, what was the point? Once you reach that top marginal rate, do you really care? 90% of everything that you make is taken. So at some point, the taxes get so high, you have no incentive to do more. For other people in the Soviet Union and places like that, it's just becomes everything is focused on the collective. And so you as an individual have no reason to work harder than the person who is working next to you. So if you're in some factory, why would you work harder than the person next to you? You both go home with the same wage at the end of the day. You both go home with the same living conditions. You're both entitled to the same things. So if you're, as long as you're not the worst person in the factory, you're fine. As long as everybody is equally bad, everyone's fine. And it becomes a race to the bottom, right? How little work do we have to do to just make the socialist overlords happy? That's right. What it becomes in any socialist system, right? Inevitably, that's what it becomes. What's the bare minimum I have to do to get through this? Because doing more doesn't get me anywhere, right? So how do you combat that? Well, in any kind of a market system, you combat that by incentivizing people to work harder, right? You say, well, we'll give you more money. We'll give you better wage. We'll give you better benefits. We'll give you better living conditions. We'll do something for you to make your life better. But you can't do that in a socialist system because you've told everybody that that's an evil way of doing things. You can't have that, right? Yeah. So you've got to come up with some other way to incentivize people. So what usually happens is they just start killing people or throwing people in gulags or doing something like that. But that's not a persuasive thing to do for people. So while they're throwing people in gulags and killing people and whatever, they're also trying to convince them that this is for the good of the collective. You can be a better person. Don't give in to your animalistic, indoctrinated, old way of doing things where all the capitalists had tricked you into believing that you needed to work harder in order to make more money, in order to have a better life. That's a lie. There's plenty of wealth out there, right? And you see shades of this in Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and people like that all the time. They'll say things like, there's more than enough wealth. It's the richest nation in the world. Why should people have to pay for this or pay for that or work hard for this or work hard for that? We should just be able to provide people with these things, right? Yeah. And so they tried, there was this real attempt by the Soviets and by lots of early socialists to convince people that they could become better human beings.
Well, I think that's kind of what it like really all started as is the kind of the propaganda arm, right? You know, like that's like the base level of this. And it all kind of stems from that concept from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And like that idea kind of flies in the face of human nature, right? So it's like they had to figure out a way to have people act against their own real self-interest, which is the thing that kind of propels society, right? Generally speaking. And, you know, it got to a point where like the propaganda, I think what you're going in towards is like kind of the propaganda, trying to convince people of this fact. And the examples that I have here goes a step further. But I mean, I guess that is the first real step.
I think some of it is propaganda, but I think some of these people actually believed that this was possible and was inevitable. This is a theme that we come back to a lot when we're talking about people who really believed in what Karl Marx taught. Karl Marx believed that socialism was inevitable. It was going to happen. Sure. That people, and part of that was, and this is often lost on modern society because we don't think in these terms necessarily, but in the days of Karl Marx and in the early 1900s, there was a strong, strong emphasis on the idea of evolution. Evolution was really important in intellectual circles. And everyone believed that people were evolving. They were becoming smarter. They were becoming better. They were improving. And that society was improving as people were improving. And so you can see how if you believe in this and you frame your whole worldview is shaped by this idea that you would believe that we could have this utopian socialist world where everyone just voluntarily chooses to live in this perfect, paradise where they're all sacrificing for the greater good because they believe that their human nature was also evolving and getting better and progressing. And so they saw this as all sort of this inevitable movement toward a better humanity, right? Mm-hmm. And so for them, they didn't look at it and say, well, how can we make people do something that's contradictory to their human nature? They would say, how can we speed up the process of people's human natures evolving and progressing in this better way? They thought that was going to happen anyway. And so it was, how can we push this along? Because we can't wait any longer. We got to push this thing forward. That was really at the core of all of this. And it explains so much of their thinking, because then if you think of it like that and you say, okay, well, the people in society who have this worldview, they must be the progressive people who have advanced to this higher stage of human evolution, right? So then it makes perfect sense why those people should be in charge and not all these other fools. They shouldn't be in charge because they haven't progressed enough in society. And then you get into all of these different ideas about, well, why do some human civilizations and races progress better than other races, and and you get into some really nasty, awful forms of racism, and it gets really, really bad, but it's all tied in with their ideology. They were not separate things. They were all interconnected.
Right. And the weird part about it is when you get past like the idea of propaganda, we're just trying to convince people that like it's for the greater good, and you get into these like pseudo scientific realms, it starts getting really creepy. And like, the Hitler and eugenics and trying to create like the Aryan race or whatever they call it. In Cambodia, Pol Pot wanted to create the master race using social engineering. In the USSR, Pavlov, like Pavlov's dog, right? Ringing the bell when they feed them, and eventually you drool, all of that, right? That's like all this psychological conditioning. And that he was commissioned to basically try to figure out how to get people to act against that kind of innate human nature and instead work for the greater good or the collective, the Soviet Union, right? That was picked up by Mao in China. He ran with that Pavlovian conditioning to basically try to craft these specific human nature that they would help support their country. So you see this time and time again in all of these countries. And I think that where we're seeing it now is in China again, but now it's through not these like, false eugenics and scientific things. They're using technology to do it. Now, anyone that's followed us on Stopping Socialism from the earlier days knows that we've been covering the concept of the China social credit scores. So, Justin, I mean, you could probably talk about that to an extent, right?
Yeah, for those who don't know, China is in the process of rolling out, and really we need to probably do an update and see where things are with that, because we haven't done that in a while. But China is in the process of rolling out a social credit system. They've already rolled it out in certain places. What is a social credit system? It is essentially a government-created way of measuring how good of a citizen you are in society, and then rewarding people or punishing people depending on how good or bad you are as a citizen. So by having this massive surveillance state that can keep track of everybody, they can determine, when people are breaking laws, when people are spending their money irresponsibly, when they're, getting too many speeding tickets. And they
going on websites that are not particularly, not particularly approved by the government.
Exactly. And then take all that information and quantify it and turn it into a score so that people have actual scores. So some people are really good citizens, have high scores. They do everything the way the government wants them to do. And then other people have really bad scores. And then these scores affect their ability to, let's say, potentially get a job or get a loan or various other things that happen in society.
Transportation.
Yep. Where
places you can live.
Yep. It's really endless what you could end up doing with this, right? You could imagine a system where it's like, well, what if there's a limited number of vaccinations for some particular thing, like, I don't know, coronavirus or something. Who gets the vaccinations first if there's a limited number? Do the low-scored people, the undesirables, the people who aren't following the laws, why should they get the vaccination? Shouldn't you give it to the people who have been good citizens all along? I mean, you can see how, what if there's a limited number of fertility drugs available? Or what if that's something that had actually happened in the United Kingdom at one point in time, and they were, basically giving the drugs to people who were healthier and based on like body weight and that sort of thing. So you can see how these kinds of ideas, if you had a system where you could easily and quickly judge who's a good citizen and who's a bad citizen, could easily be used by the government to incentivize all kinds of different behavior, reward the people who are, in line with their beliefs, and punish the people who are not. It's a really easy way to control society. So this system is being rolled out in China, believe it or not. It's already been rolled out in certain parts of China. They've been slowly doing test cases of it in various regions and that sort of thing. And their plan is to roll this out across the entire country so that every single Chinese citizen has a score. And that score determines where they stand in society and what benefits are available to them, what benefits are available to their children, etc., to try to encourage people to behave the right way. This is another form of social engineering. You don't have to, indoctrinate people or have eugenics or do any of this stuff because technology has made it easier for you to control people. You don't need to do that anymore.
And that's the real scary thing. I mean, when you look back, you could make the argument when you're looking back at like the Soviet Union or some of these old socialist regimes that one of the biggest reasons why it fell apart was because people would rather just work in their own self-interest, or they didn't have that incentive to go above and beyond and to innovate and to work harder than the person next to them because, like Justin said, you're not going to get anything out of it, right? So you can make the argument that these things fell apart because there wasn't this model socialist citizen that was out there that was giving giving according to his ability, right? So, but this way, the way that China's got it set up, it's like it's almost to a point where creating this model socialist citizen is actually possible, or it's at least on the verge of being possible. It's kind of a scary thing.
Oh, it's terrifying. So one of the things libertarians like, if you're a libertarian and you read lots of libertarian literature and that sort of thing, Donnie and I have sort of a long background in libertarianism, and so we are very aware of this. But if you read Reason or any of those kinds of publications, or you like Milton Friedman and Hayek and those people, what you'll see is one of the biggest critiques, and I think it's a valid critique, and I think it's accurate, of throughout libertarianism, of any attempt of government to control things, is that anytime government tries to control things with taxes or regulations, however minute they are, people will try to find a way around those things, right? They create black markets, right? And these black markets inevitably corrupt and destroy these systems. The systems these systems never work the way that they're supposed to work, in part because people will find a way around them, right? And so actually, one of the reasons why these dictatorships become so brutal is because people don't follow the party line. And so they have to find a way to impose it. Otherwise, the whole system breaks down, right? In America and in places where you have more freedom, the government inevitably changes the laws, or they just look the other way while these things are happening. But in a socialist society where you can't really afford to do that because everything is so tightly controlled, if anything is not working the way it's supposed to, the whole system comes crumbling down. You start throwing people in gulags, you start killing people, you start confiscating property. You have to do these things. That's a core part of the history of socialism and communism governments, or communist governments. So that's always been a critique of libertarians, right? What technology does, though, because that crackdown, those crackdowns speed up the collapse of those societies. Because as you crack down on your citizens, people realize there's something wrong with this system. This can't be right. And inevitably, these regimes don't last. They can't last because the systems become too brutal and violent, and everybody knows brutality and violence is wrong. Nobody wants to live through that. So these crackdowns always backfire, right? But what technology does is it allows these regimes to crack down and control behavior without necessarily having to go to that next step as quickly. It allows them to, I'm just coming up with this now, and it sounds like a fantastic book title, by the way. It allows sort of a perfection of tyranny, or perfecting tyranny, right? That's what this is. This technology, the social credit score, all these other things, it allows regimes to be tyrants, but do it in the nicest, most benign way possible, where you don't ever really have to see them cracking down on people. They can control everything just through the internet, just through surveillance, all of these other, you don't have to throw people in prison to make sure that they're not doing the right things. You can just spy on them through your thousands and thousands of cameras and having control over their computers and everything else. You don't need to be afraid of what they're doing. You can just watch them whenever you feel like it, and then put them in prison when they're doing something you don't like, right? Or you don't even have to put them in prison. Just give them a really low social credit score, and now their lives are ruined anyway. You've ruined their lives, So you're able to do these things without killing people now. You can have tyranny without the brutality of it necessarily. And I think that gives, I think, those regimes a much better chance of success in the long run, because you don't have to, the crackdown isn't going to be as stiff immediately.
So I guess the next logical question is, can we see this happening in America, I guess, or just kind of like a Western society type country? Like, can we see this type of social credit score system that's kind of in China coming to America? And I mean, in one way, I could almost say that we've got it in a voluntary sense based on all of our social media aspects. I mean, it's not quantified in a specific credit score, but I could see that being the potential. And then the other way that I could totally see it happening is like in a healthcare, in a system where we have universal healthcare, and you have all of these factors that are determining whether or not you're the criteria, whether or not you're a smoker or how overweight you are, your age, all of these different things, lifestyle choices, all of that, and basically determines where you are on the rationing list. So I could see it kind of coming out there, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. I think healthcare is maybe the first area where you're likely to see it in the West, because if you move to a single payer healthcare system, and many Western countries, most Western countries already have, then everybody has an interest in everyone else's health because I'm paying for it, right? Yeah. That's the logic of it. Exactly. If society is paying for your healthcare bill, then you have an obligation to be healthy. Well, how can we make sure that you're being healthy? Well, we have to track you. We have to make sure that you're, doing the right things. This is already happening. When people go to the doctors, there's medical records, electronic medical records. They keep track of your weight. They keep track of your blood sugar. They keep track of all these different things already. It would only be one step further after you have a single payer healthcare system to put this in some sort of a database, assign some kind of a score to it, and then just provide people with rewards or punishments who are not living a healthy lifestyle. It's not hard to imagine something like that happening. They have done this already to some degree, as I already mentioned, in the United Kingdom and other places, in certain situations where you've got limited supplies of certain kinds of products or services or whatever. And they've said, we're not going to give it to you people over here. We're going to give it instead to these people because they've got some sort of quality about them that we think makes them more deserving of this. So the example I gave earlier was in the United Kingdom, they had a fertility drug for people who are getting artificial insemination, that kind of thing. They had a fertility drug that they were providing. It's an important part of making that process happen. And they had a limited amount of it. And they were turning people away, couples away, where the interestingly, the father in this case would be, or potential father would be too overweight. And they were instead giving it to the couples who had better BMIs, better body mass indexes. Yeah. Right. So why? Well, because it's some way of deciding who's going to be, a better father, I guess. If you're in better shape, then you're better health, then I guess you're more likely to survive a longer period of time and you should be the one that has the child. I don't know. It's a ridiculous way of looking at things, but that's what they did. And so if you just had them up, you can see 50 years from now when technology is better, when the mass surveillance state is much larger, when you have all this stuff computerized and it's all through electronic records, gigantic databases where they could keep track of this, how easy it would be for them to say, you get a tax break if you go to the gym 3 times a week. You get a tax break if your cholesterol is this low, if your, caloric intake is XYZ. It would be so easy for them to do that. And we've talked about this before. We're getting more and more into this. They're already starting to do this with companies. Yes.
That's where I wanted to go with next, because the idea of a socialist country is to basically try to control the society, the people, as well as the production, right? The economy itself. And obviously the Soviet Union had like the literal ownership of the means of production. They owned the factories. They got to tell you, what companies made when and how much of it. But now in this day and age, that doesn't seem like a very practical way. If you look at our stuff with the Great Reset and all of that, it kind of shows like a new way of socialism to get those same ends, but just a different means to those ends. And Justin, go ahead with those ESG criteria.
Right. So in the United States and then elsewhere, really all over the world, corporations are adopting this thing called ESG standards. It stands for environment. I think social is the middle one, society or social. I think it's social. Environment, social, and governance standards, ESG. And what they are is essentially ways of measuring a corporation's value that has nothing to do with profit. Okay? It's not about finances. These are about other things. So the environment part of the ESG standards are how green are these companies? How sustainably are they acting? How much land are they taking up? How much pollution is involved in their supply chains? How are they involved in the fossil fuel industry? Are they contributing to global warming? These would all be factors in the ESG, coming up with an ESG score. Okay. The social part might be how well they're paying their employees, how inclusive are they, how many minorities are they hiring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And governance standards are usually related to compensation for the people who are in charge of the organization, how the structure of the corporation is, those kinds of things. So none of these things have anything to do with profit directly, right? So a company could be very, very profitable, but have a very low ESG score because they're doing something that's bad for the environment or deemed bad for society in some other way. So, for example, when we were looking at one index, Boeing, the company Boeing, which is a massive, massive company, had a low ESG score because they're involved in making weapons. Okay. And it was determined that if you're involved in making certain kinds of weapons, you have a low ESG score. All right. So what does this all mean? Well, right now, ESG scores are being used to build these indexes that investors can invest in if they want to be, environmentally conscious, or they want to be concerned about social causes or whatever. They don't want to invest in companies that are involved in tobacco sales or, weapons manufacturing. So they only invest in these indexes that exclude all these bad companies. These companies are bad for society. They're not breaking any laws, these companies. They're all following the laws. They're not illegal. They're just companies that are not doing things that are considered to be in the best interest of the collective, right? That's what this is. So right now, it's all very voluntary in many cases, or in nearly all cases. But what people on the left want to do is take these ESG scores and use them when figuring out how much money certain companies get. Who should the government do business with, right? Should the government award a contract to a company that has a low ESG score? Why? Why should they do that? Should the government give money, bailout money, money related to coronavirus, money related to other investments to companies that are doing things that are bad for the planet, or who are just, don't have enough African Americans working there, or don't have enough women working, or whatever? I mean, how should you make these decisions? These ESG scores allow for government to have the opportunity to decide. We talk about picking winners and losers. It's like that, but not just winners and losers. It's, are you a good citizen of the world, or are you a bad citizen of the world?
Right.
Are you a good corporation or a bad corporation? And that's how these scores can be used. And so when you take that to the next step and you start funneling money only into the quote good guys, the good companies, and you exclude providing money to the bad companies, well, right now under our current system, that might just be, a bad economic decision for that business. If they're not in the ESG thing, maybe they get hurt a little bit by it, but they're not necessarily crushed by it. But if the government really picks up the pace in spending money and starts controlling most of the money spent in society, well, now you're just destroying whole industries, whole businesses, just ruining companies. And again, even whole industries like the fossil fuel industry, for example, because they're not, good for the environment. And this is the movement that many people on the left, many world leaders want to move toward. They want to move toward a society where we're not going to take away your bad business. We're not even going to regulate you out of existence. But what we are going to do is we're going to spend most of the money in society, and we're only going to spend it on the companies that are woke. If you're not a woke company, then you shouldn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, you could see how this ESG concept is very similar to like the Chinese social credit scores. And China is using the social credit scores to help create the model socialist citizen. With these ESG scores, it's basically a way of trying to create the model collectivist company. So you can see how it all ties together and how you need these things working in the way that they need for the collective, for their collective socialist societies to actually operate the way that they need them to. And this just seems to be the future. And as we continue with our Stopping Socialism project, we're finding these pieces and we're putting them together and showing how when they're all interlinked together, it starts to revealing the picture of what a 21st century socialism country will look like. So if you're interested in those concepts and want to see more information on this, you can go to stoppingsocialism.com, find a whole bunch of articles on this type of stuff. You can follow us on Facebook, Stopping Socialism. You can find more videos like this on our YouTube channel, Stopping Socialism TV. We also have an Instagram account and a Parler account if you want to follow us. And Justin, where can people find you?
At Justin T. Haskins on Socialist Twitter and Facebook.
That's right. We'll talk to you later.